Elizabeth Blake was an emblem of success in New York City's legal circles. Her sharp wit and strategic thinking had won her high-profile cases, earning her both admiration and envy among her peers. On the surface, Elizabeth led a life others could only dream of: luxury apartments overlooking Central Park, evenings spent at exclusive social events, and vacations in the world's most beautiful destinations. But behind the immaculate facade lay a wound that had never healed. 8 years ago, the joy in Elizabeth's life had been shattered. Her son, Lucas, was kidnapped at the age of 5. The memory still haunted her, playing out in vivid flashbacks that invaded her moments of quiet. She could still recall the desperate phone call she received that day, the chilling voice on the other end demanding a ransom. Despite her compliance, Lucas never came back. The police investigation stalled, and leads went cold. Over time, friends and colleagues stopped asking, assuming she had moved on. But Elizabeth never stopped searching, privately combing through any information that might point to her son's whereabouts. Her determination had a cost. Personal relationships became strained, her smiles became scarce, and her conversations guarded. The only person who remained a constant presence in her life was Catherine, her younger sister. Catherine was everything Elizabeth wasn't: warm, laid-back, and nurturing. She ran a small art gallery in Brooklyn, far removed from the corporate legal world Elizabeth inhabited. Despite their differences, the sisters had always been close. Catherine had been there for Elizabeth in the days after Lucas's disappearance, comforting her through sleepless nights filled with sobs. However, there were unresolved tensions beneath the surface. Catherine had once harbored dreams of a more glamorous life, but had felt overshadowed by Elizabeth's successes. There were whispers, brief comments veiled in jokes, little reminders of a sibling rivalry that never fully faded. Elizabeth sensed Catherine's occasional envy, but she chose to overlook it, believing that family was all she had left. One rainy afternoon, as Elizabeth was rushing to a meeting, she caught sight of a young boy standing on a corner, shivering under the weight of a wet hoodie, his small frame barely holding up a bundle of roses for sale. There was something in the boy's posture, in the determined look on his face, that stopped Elizabeth dead in her tracks. She felt a jolt, a sense of familiarity she couldn't explain. She walked over to the boy, pulling a few bills from her purse. "I'll take a dozen," she said, her voice unusually soft. The boy handed her the flowers, his dark eyes meeting hers for the briefest moment. "Thank you, ma'am," he said, his voice steady but hollow. Elizabeth's heart skipped a beat. There was something about the way he spoke, an inflection, perhaps, that reminded her of Lucas. But that was impossible. Lucas would be 13 now. This boy couldn't be older than 12. Still, Elizabeth felt compelled to act. "Do you have somewhere to go?" she asked, trying to sound casual. The boy hesitated, then nodded quickly. "Yes, but I can't go there now. I need to sell these." Elizabeth sensed the lie but didn't press. "What if you come with me for a meal? You can warm up, and I'll buy the rest of your flowers." The boy seemed torn, glancing around nervously before nodding slowly. Elizabeth felt a strange mixture of hope and fear, unsure of what she was even hoping for. They walked together to a nearby diner, the rain pouring harder as they hurried inside. As they sat down, Elizabeth couldn't help but study the boy's face, the shape of his eyes, the curve of his lips. "What's your name?" she asked, her tone carefully neutral. "Tommy," the boy replied, avoiding her gaze. The conversation that followed was guarded. Tommy spoke little about his past, giving only vague answers to Elizabeth's questions. Despite the boy's reluctance, Elizabeth felt a growing certainty. Something about Tommy seemed hauntingly familiar. When he reached for the ketchup bottle, she caught sight of a small scar on his wrist. It looked oddly similar to one Lucas had gotten from a fall in the park. Her heart raced, but she tried to maintain her composure. "You remind me of someone," she said cautiously. Tommy just shrugged, as if used to being compared to others. The rain outside showed no signs of letting up, and Elizabeth made a split-second decision. "You can stay at my place tonight," she offered, surprising herself with the words. Tommy looked up, his eyes wide with a mix of surprise and suspicion. "Why would you do that?" Elizabeth managed a faint smile. "Maybe I just want some company." Elizabeth watched the boy across the small diner table. He was eating ravenously, as if he hadn't had a proper meal in days. She studied him closely, noting every detail. His unkempt hair, dirt-streaked cheeks, and the oversized jacket that swallowed his thin frame. Tommy seemed cautious, his eyes darting around the diner, always alert. She cleared her throat, trying to sound casual. "Where do you usually sleep, Tommy?" Tommy paused, mid-bite, his expression suddenly guarded. "Wherever I can," he muttered, glancing down. "Sometimes with friends, sometimes outside." Elizabeth's chest tightened. The image of her son, wherever he was, alone and vulnerable on the streets, flashed before her eyes. She had to remind herself that this wasn't Lucas, but the familiar pang of hope mixed with desperation was undeniable. "Tonight," she said gently, "you don't have to sleep outside. You can stay at my place, just for tonight." He looked up, his eyes wide and wary. "Why are you helping me? People don't usually do this." Elizabeth held his gaze, searching for a trace of recognition. "Maybe I just think you deserve a break." He hesitated, his face conflicted. "Okay," he finally whispered. Elizabeth's apartment in the Upper East Side was a stark contrast to Tommy's reality. When they arrived, he paused at the entrance, looking up at the grand facade of the building. "Is this where you live?" he asked, almost incredulously. Elizabeth nodded, realizing how distant this world must seem to a boy like him. "Yeah, it's home," she replied softly, guiding him inside. Once upstairs, Tommy's eyes widened as he took in the luxurious surroundings, the high ceilings, the soft lighting, and the elegant furniture. He stood awkwardly in the foyer, unsure of where to go or what to do. "You can sit on the couch," Elizabeth said, sensing his discomfort. "Make yourself comfortable." Tommy hesitated but eventually sat down, still holding his worn backpack close. Elizabeth stepped into the kitchen, trying to steady herself. She was acting impulsively, she knew that, but there was an inexplicable pull she couldn't resist. As she prepared some tea, her mind raced with questions. Who was Tommy? Why did he feel so familiar? She had to remind herself to be patient, to not let the raw hope cloud her judgment. After all, she had chased false leads before, and each one left a scar that felt deeper than the last. Returning to the living room, she handed Tommy a cup of hot chocolate. "Here you go," she said. "It'll warm you up." Tommy took the mug with both hands, his fingers barely poking out from the sleeves of his jacket. He seemed genuinely surprised by the simple gesture of kindness. As he sipped slowly, Elizabeth sat across from him. "Where's your family, Tommy?" she asked gently, trying not to sound too probing. Tommy's eyes darkened, and his grip on the mug tightened. "I don't have one," he replied flatly. Elizabeth felt a lump form in her throat. "What about your parents? Do you remember them?" He looked up sharply, his eyes suddenly defensive. "I don't like talking about that," he said, his voice tense. Elizabeth nodded slowly, understanding the need for caution. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to pry." Tommy's expression softened slightly, as if sensing her sincerity. "It's okay," he muttered. As the night wore on, Elizabeth offered to show Tommy the guest room. It was a small but cozy space, with a neatly made bed and a window overlooking the city. Tommy paused at the doorway. "This is for me?" he asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. "Just for tonight," Elizabeth assured him. "You can rest here. There's clean clothes on the bed, too." Tommy entered the room cautiously, as if afraid it might disappear. He turned to Elizabeth, his expression a mix of gratitude and uncertainty. "Thank you, really." Elizabeth smiled warmly. "You're welcome, Tommy. I just want you to be safe." She closed the door gently behind her, leaning against it for a moment. Her mind was spinning. There was something about Tommy that she couldn't shake off, a nagging feeling deep inside her. It wasn't just the scar on his wrist or the way he moved. It was a sense of connection, like a whisper from the past. That night, sleep didn't come easily for Elizabeth. Her mind kept drifting back to Lucas, to the day he was taken, and to the years that followed. Years of desperate searching, empty leads, and crushing disappointment. But now, with Tommy in the next room, a tiny flicker of hope dared to emerge once more. The next morning, Elizabeth woke up to the sound of clattering in the kitchen. She rushed out of her bedroom, her heart racing. To her surprise, she found Tommy standing on a stool, trying to reach the top shelf of the cabinet. "What are you doing?" she asked, more surprised than angry. Tommy jumped, almost dropping the bowl in his hand. I was just trying to make breakfast," he stammered. Elizabeth's heart softened. "It's okay," she said gently. "You don't have to do that. Let me make breakfast." Tommy stepped down from the stool, looking embarrassed. "I'm just used to taking care of myself," he said quietly. As they sat down to eat, the morning sun streamed through the windows, casting a warm glow over the table. Elizabeth felt a strange sense of normalcy, a fleeting moment of peace she hadn't experienced in years. She looked at Tommy, who was eating quietly but steadily, his face still marked by uncertainty. "What if you stayed a bit longer?" she found herself asking. Tommy's head snapped up, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Really? You mean like, here?" Elizabeth nodded. "Just until you figure things out. You don't have to keep running, Tommy." His gaze softened, the hardness in his eyes giving way to vulnerability. "I don't know. I've never had someone offer me that before." Elizabeth leaned forward, her voice firm but kind. "Well, you do now. But it's up to you." For the first time since they met, Tommy allowed himself a small, cautious smile. Over the next few days, Tommy's presence became part of Elizabeth's daily routine. He was still wary, often retreating into silence or avoiding eye contact, but Elizabeth noticed small changes. He seemed less tense, his movements more relaxed, and occasionally, a genuine smile would slip through his guarded expression. But it was the little things that caught her attention. His mannerisms, his laugh, the way he absent-mindedly tapped his fingers against the kitchen counter while waiting for his breakfast. These were details that nagged at her, stirring memories of Lucas that she had buried deep within. Elizabeth couldn't shake the feeling that this boy was more than just a stranger in need. She found herself watching him closely, trying to piece together the fragments of a story that felt familiar yet elusive. One evening, as they were sitting in the living room, Elizabeth decided to ask more about Tommy's past. She kept her voice casual, not wanting to scare him off. "So, Tommy, where were you before New York? Have you always been here?" Tommy shrugged, his eyes on the TV. "I've been around different places. I don't really remember where I started." Elizabeth felt a pang of frustration but didn't press further. She had learned that pushing too hard only made Tommy withdraw. Instead, she changed the subject. "You like pizza? I was thinking of ordering some tonight." Tommy's face lit up for a brief moment before he quickly masked it with indifference. "Yeah, sure. Pizza's good." Elizabeth couldn't help but smile. "All right then, it's settled." Later that night, as they ate their pizza on the coffee table, Tommy seemed more at ease than usual. He was talking about a stray cat he had seen on the street the day before, describing it with a surprising level of detail. Elizabeth listened intently, enjoying the sound of his voice, which had grown slightly more animated. "You know," Tommy said suddenly, his tone turning serious, "I wasn't always on the streets. I had a family once." Elizabeth's heart skipped a beat. She tried to keep her voice steady. "What happened to them?" Tommy's face darkened. I don't really know. I was taken away when I was young. After that, it's all a blur." Elizabeth felt a chill run down her spine. She wanted to ask more, to dig deeper, but she sensed that pushing him further would be a mistake. Instead, she simply nodded, her heart aching with a mix of hope and fear. Over the next week, Elizabeth began discreetly investigating Tommy's background. She hired a private investigator, Mark, who had worked with her on Lucas's case years ago. She didn't reveal her suspicions, only telling Mark that she wanted to ensure the boy's safety. "Can you find out where he's been and if anyone's looking for him?" Elizabeth asked, her voice tense with anticipation. Mark nodded, his expression serious. "I'll do my best, Elizabeth, but you know how these things go. Finding answers can take time." "I understand," she replied, her gaze drifting toward the window, where Tommy was sitting on the fire escape, staring at the city below. "But I need to know." While waiting for Mark's report, Elizabeth tried to maintain a sense of normalcy at home. She and Tommy fell into a rhythm. Mornings were quiet, with Elizabeth making breakfast while Tommy watched TV or sketched in an old notebook she had found for him. Afternoons were spent running errands or visiting nearby parks, where Tommy seemed to relax the most. But there were still moments when Elizabeth's suspicions resurfaced. One day, as they were walking through Central Park, she noticed Tommy stop suddenly, staring at a group of boys playing soccer. For a moment, his face lit up with an expression she hadn't seen before. An innocent, childlike joy. "Do you want to join them?" Elizabeth asked, trying to sound encouraging. Tommy shook his head quickly, the moment of joy fading into apprehension. "No, I'm okay. I don't know those kids." Elizabeth sensed there was more to his reluctance, but she let it go. "All right," she said softly. "We can just watch then." As they continued walking, Elizabeth found herself filled with an overwhelming sense of longing. She wanted answers, but more than that, she wanted to protect Tommy, to offer him the safety and love he seemed to have been deprived of for so long. That evening, Elizabeth received a call from Mark. "Elizabeth, I found something," he said, his tone serious. Elizabeth's heart raced. "What is it?" "There's no record of a boy named Tommy matching his description in the city's child services database," Mark continued. "But I did find a missing persons report from 8 years ago. Your son, Lucas. I don't want to raise false hope, but there are some physical similarities between Lucas's description and this boy." "You mentioned a scar?" Elizabeth felt her knees weaken, and she had to sit down. "Yes, he has a scar on his wrist, just like Lucas." Mark's voice softened. "It could be a coincidence, Elizabeth, but it's worth pursuing." Elizabeth felt a surge of both hope and fear. "What should I do?" "Get a DNA test," Mark suggested. "It's the only way to know for sure." Elizabeth hung up the phone, her hands shaking. She turned to see Tommy standing in the hallway, his expression unreadable. "Who was that?" he asked. Elizabeth forced a smile. "Just a friend," she replied. "Listen, Tommy, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me." Tommy's eyes narrowed slightly, as if sensing the gravity of the moment. "Okay, I want to do a DNA test," Elizabeth said, her voice steady but urgent. "It's just to make sure, to see if you might have family somewhere." Tommy's face clouded with confusion and fear. "Why would you do that? What if it doesn't matter?" Elizabeth stepped closer, her voice soft but firm. "It matters, Tommy. It matters more than you know." He looked away, his shoulders slumping. "Okay," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "We can do it." The days that followed were filled with unbearable tension. Elizabeth tried to keep things normal, but the weight of the impending results was heavy in the air. She noticed that Tommy seemed more withdrawn, as if sensing the storm that was coming. Then, one morning, the results arrived. Elizabeth sat at her desk, staring at the envelope with trembling hands. She ripped it open, her breath hitching as she read the words, "Positive match." Her world spun as tears streamed down her face. It was Lucas. Her son was right there, in her home, after all these years. But before Elizabeth could process the shock, she heard a noise behind her. She turned to see Tommy, or rather, Lucas, standing in the doorway. His face was a mixture of confusion, fear, and anger. "You knew, didn't you?" he accused, his voice shaking. "You've been looking for me this whole time." Elizabeth's heart broke at the pain in his voice. "I didn't know for sure," she whispered, stepping closer. "But I hoped with everything I had." Lucas backed away, tears streaming down his face. "Why did you let this happen to me? Why didn't you find me sooner?" Elizabeth's own tears fell freely now. "I tried, Lucas. I never stopped looking. But I swear, I'm here now, and I'll never leave you again." Lucas stood there, trembling, as if torn between anger and the deep need for the mother he'd lost. The hours that followed the revelation were tense, filled with uncertainty and raw emotions. Elizabeth desperately wanted to hold Lucas, to make up for every lost moment. But Lucas remained distant, his expression a mix of confusion, anger, and fear. He was no longer the fragile boy Tommy. He was Lucas, and everything was suddenly more real, more painful. Elizabeth tried to keep things normal that morning. She prepared breakfast with trembling hands, unsure of what to say or do. She felt like she was walking on eggshells, afraid that one wrong word might shatter what little trust had formed between them. Lucas sat at the table, barely touching his food. His eyes were red, and he stared down, avoiding Elizabeth's gaze. The silence was unbearable, heavy with everything that needed to be said but remained unspoken. "Lucas," Elizabeth began gently, her voice breaking the quiet. "I know this is a lot to take in. I never stopped searching for you. Not for one moment." Lucas flinched at the sound of his name. It was as if hearing it from her lips made it real, made the past 8 years undeniable. He looked up, his eyes filled with pain. "Why didn't you find me sooner?" he asked, his voice cracking with the weight of his emotions. Elizabeth's heart broke at the question. "I tried," she whispered, her voice heavy with regret. "I tried everything. The police, private investigators, everything I could think of. But you were just gone." Lucas's gaze was sharp, filled with years of unspoken anger. "Do you know what it was like? Being taken away, not knowing why or if anyone was looking for me." Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears. "I can't even imagine," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I swear to you, Lucas, I never stopped hoping. I never stopped believing that one day I'd find you." Lucas's eyes softened for a brief moment, but then the anger returned, simmering beneath the surface. "I don't know if I can just be your son again. It's been too long." Elizabeth nodded, swallowing hard. "I understand. I'm not asking you to pretend everything is fine. I just want a chance to be here for you now." That evening, Elizabeth received an unexpected visit from Catherine. The two sisters hadn't spoken in a few weeks, and Elizabeth had been too consumed by the DNA test to think much about their strained relationship. Catherine arrived with a bottle of wine, smiling brightly, seemingly unaware of the storm that had just broken in Elizabeth's home. "Surprise," Catherine announced as she entered the apartment. "I thought we could have a girls' night, like old times." Elizabeth managed a weak smile. "Now isn't really a good time, Catherine." Catherine's expression changed, sensing the tension in the room. "What's going on? You look devastated." Before Elizabeth could respond, Lucas walked into the living room. He froze when he saw Catherine, his eyes wide with a mixture of recognition and confusion. "Who's this?" Lucas asked, his voice flat but wary. Elizabeth hesitated, glancing nervously at Catherine. "This is Catherine, my sister. Your aunt." Catherine's face went pale. "Lucas," she whispered, as if not believing what she was seeing. Her eyes filled with sudden emotion, but there was something off about it, an intensity that Elizabeth couldn't quite place. "Yes," Elizabeth confirmed, her voice steady but guarded. "This is Lucas." Catherine's eyes flickered between shock and something else, something darker. How did you find him?" she asked, her voice trembling. Elizabeth explained the encounter with Tommy, the DNA test, and the confirmation that had changed everything. Catherine listened, her expression a mix of disbelief and confusion. "This is incredible," she said, forcing a smile. "I never thought." Lucas watched Catherine carefully, his eyes narrowed. "Did you know about me?" he asked suddenly. Catherine's face froze for a moment, her eyes widening. "No, of course not. I mean, I knew you were missing, but I didn't know you were here like this." Lucas's gaze remained fixed on Catherine, as if trying to read something deeper in her reaction. "Are you sure?" Catherine hesitated, her voice slightly shaky. "Yes, Lucas, I promise." Elizabeth watched the exchange, a growing sense of unease settling in her stomach. Something about Catherine's reaction felt off, too forced. It was as if she was hiding something, but Elizabeth couldn't quite grasp what it was. That night, after Catherine had left, Lucas approached Elizabeth in the kitchen. "There's something weird about her," he said bluntly. Elizabeth looked up, surprised by the sudden statement. "What do you mean?" Lucas hesitated, his face clouded with uncertainty. "I don't know, just a feeling. When I saw her, I remembered something. I think I saw her once. After I was taken." Elizabeth felt a cold shiver run down her spine. "What? Are you sure?" Lucas nodded slowly. "I'm not certain, but there's something about her. I remember her face, or maybe her voice. Elizabeth's mind raced with the implications. Catherine had been there for her throughout the years, offering support, but what if there was more to the story? What if Catherine knew something she hadn't revealed? "Lucas, I promise you, I'll get to the bottom of this," Elizabeth vowed, her voice firm, "no matter what it takes." The next day, Elizabeth confronted Catherine. They met in a small cafe, far from the prying eyes of neighbors or colleagues. Catherine seemed nervous, her usual confidence replaced by an edge of defensiveness. "What's this about, Liz?" Catherine asked, her tone uneasy. Elizabeth leaned forward, her eyes piercing. "Did you know something about Lucas's disappearance? Did you have any involvement?" Catherine's face turned pale. "How can you even ask me that?" she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because Lucas remembers you," Elizabeth said coldly. "He thinks he saw you after he was taken." Catherine's eyes filled with tears, but there was something desperate about her reaction, as if she were struggling to maintain control. "I swear, Liz, I didn't take him. I had nothing to do with it. But did you know where he was?" Elizabeth pressed, her voice filled with pain and betrayal. Catherine looked down, her hands trembling. "I found out later," she admitted, her voice cracking. "But I couldn't say anything. I was scared." Elizabeth's world crumbled at the confession. "You knew? You knew he was out there, and you didn't tell me?" Catherine's tears flowed freely now. "I was terrified, Liz. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I thought I could fix it, but then it spiraled out of control." Elizabeth felt a surge of rage. "Do you have any idea what you've done? The years you stole from us?" "I know, and I'm so sorry," Catherine sobbed. "But I never meant to hurt you like this." Elizabeth's voice trembled with fury. "It's not just about me, Catherine. It's about Lucas. He was alone, abandoned. How could you live with yourself?" Catherine's expression was one of utter defeat. "I don't expect you to forgive me, Liz. I wish I could take it all back." Elizabeth returned home, her heart shattered. She found Lucas sitting on the couch, waiting for her. "What happened?" he asked quietly. Elizabeth sat down beside him, tears in her eyes. "It's complicated, Lucas. But I promise you, I'll make things right." Lucas looked at her, his eyes filled with a mix of hope and fear. "Are we really going to be okay?" Elizabeth nodded, her voice filled with determination. "Yes, Lucas. We will be, no matter what it takes." The days following Catherine's confession were suffocating, marked by a tension that neither Elizabeth nor Lucas could easily navigate. Catherine's revelation lingered like a dark cloud, and Elizabeth struggled to make sense of the betrayal from the one person she thought she could trust. Every glance at Lucas, every moment they shared, was now tainted with the knowledge that her own sister had kept them apart. Elizabeth wrestled with a storm of emotions, anger, guilt, and a profound sense of failure as a mother. Lucas, on the other hand, seemed adrift. He was more withdrawn than before, haunted by the confirmation of a truth he'd long suspected but could never voice. His trust in adults was already fragile, and Catherine's betrayal only deepened the cracks. Elizabeth knew she needed to act, to find a way to bring Lucas a sense of security he desperately needed. But she was torn between two conflicting impulses, the desire for justice and the lingering instinct to protect Catherine, no matter how monstrous her actions had been. One evening, as Lucas sat silently at the dinner table, Elizabeth decided to confront the issue head-on. "Lucas," she began carefully, "we need to talk about what happens next." Lucas glanced up, his expression guarded. "What do you mean?" Elizabeth took a deep breath. "What Catherine did was unforgivable. But I need to know what you want, what would make you feel safe." Lucas's eyes flashed with anger. "She should pay for what she did," he said, his voice surprisingly steady. "She kept us apart and she didn't care." Elizabeth's heart broke at the raw emotion in his voice. "I know," she whispered, "but she's still my sister. I don't know if I can turn her in." Lucas looked at her, his face a mix of disappointment and understanding. "I don't expect you to make it right overnight. I just want to know that I'm not alone in this anymore." Elizabeth reached across the table, taking his hand. "You're not alone, Lucas. I promise you that." The next morning, Elizabeth sought legal counsel. She had to understand the full implications of bringing Catherine to justice, both legally and emotionally. She met with Anna Riley, a trusted attorney she had worked with before. "So, you want to press charges against your sister?" Anna asked, her eyes searching Elizabeth's face for clarity. Elizabeth hesitated, feeling the weight of her decision. "I don't know. I want to protect Lucas, but Catherine's my sister. I can't just erase that." Anna nodded, her voice calm but firm. "Elizabeth, this is a complicated situation. If you pursue charges, it could mean jail time for Catherine. But it could also mean closure for Lucas." Elizabeth felt tears well up in her eyes. "I just want him to heal, to feel like he's safe again." Anna leaned forward, her tone gentle. "The law can only do so much. It's really about what Lucas needs right now. If pressing charges feels like the right step, then we'll do that. But if reconciliation, even partial, is possible, that's something only you and Lucas can decide." Elizabeth left the office with a heavy heart, unsure of what the right path forward was. Back at home, Elizabeth found Lucas sitting by the window, staring blankly at the city below. "Hey," she said softly. "I just came back from seeing my lawyer." Lucas didn't look at her. "What did she say?" Elizabeth hesitated. "She said it's up to us. If we want to press charges, we can. But it's going to be hard." Lucas finally turned to face her, his eyes tired but determined. "What do you want to do?" Elizabeth's voice cracked. "I want you to feel safe, Lucas. That's all that matters to me." Lucas nodded slowly. "Then let's do it." She needs to face what she did. Elizabeth's chest tightened at the words, but she knew Lucas was right. "Okay," she agreed, her voice steady despite the tears threatening to spill. "We'll do it together." A few days later, Elizabeth filed an official police report against Catherine. The process was agonizing, reliving the details, recounting Lucas's kidnapping, and facing the reality that her sister had been complicit. As they left the police station, Lucas seemed both relieved and conflicted. "Are you okay?" Elizabeth asked as they got into the car. Lucas stared out the window, his face unreadable. "I don't know. It feels good, but it also hurts." Elizabeth reached over, squeezing his hand. "I know, Lucas. But this is the start of healing, even if it's painful." Lucas nodded, but the weight of what had just happened was still heavy on both of them. The following week was a blur of police interviews, legal consultations, and difficult conversations. Catherine was arrested, and the news spread quickly among Elizabeth's family and friends. It was a scandal that rocked her already fragile world, but Elizabeth remained focused on Lucas. One evening, as they sat on the couch, Elizabeth sensed that Lucas was struggling with something deeper. "What's on your mind?" she asked gently. Lucas hesitated, then spoke slowly. I keep thinking about what it would have been like if none of this happened. If I'd never been taken." Elizabeth's heart ached at the thought. "I think about that too," she admitted. "Every single day." Lucas looked at her, his eyes filled with an overwhelming sadness. "Do you think we can ever have a normal life again?" Elizabeth's voice was soft but determined. "It might take time, Lucas, but I believe we can. We'll find a new normal, one step at a time." As the legal proceedings moved forward, Elizabeth found herself grappling with conflicting emotions. Seeing Catherine in court was both cathartic and devastating. Her sister looked broken, her eyes hollow, and for a moment, Elizabeth felt a pang of sympathy. But then she remembered the years of pain, the nights spent crying for a son who was lost and alone. She remembered Lucas's haunted eyes, his quiet struggles, and the long journey still ahead of them. Catherine's lawyer approached Elizabeth during a recess. "She wants to talk to you," he said, his expression neutral. "She says she has something to say." Elizabeth hesitated, unsure if she could face her sister's excuses or pleas for mercy. But she owed it to herself and to Lucas to hear whatever Catherine had to say. The two sisters met in a small, private room adjacent to the courtroom. Catherine looked gaunt, her eyes red-rimmed and filled with regret. "Liz," she began, her voice breaking, "I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I need you to understand. I never meant for it to go this far." Elizabeth's face was stoic, her voice cold. "You had years to come clean, Catherine. Years. Catherine's tears flowed freely now. I know, and I live with that guilt every day. But please, Liz, I never stopped caring about you. I never wanted to hurt Lucas like this. Elizabeth's heart ached, but she remained firm. It's not about me anymore, Catherine. It's about Lucas and what he needs to heal. Catherine nodded, her face a mask of sorrow. I hope you both find peace. I really do. Elizabeth stood up, her voice unwavering. I hope you find it too, Catherine, but you have to earn it. When Elizabeth returned to the courtroom, she found Lucas waiting for her. He looked up, searching her face for answers. Are you okay? He asked quietly. Elizabeth nodded, her voice steady. Yes, I think I am, finally. As the trial continued, Elizabeth and Lucas sat side by side, a united front in the face of the past that had tried to tear them apart. It was a long road ahead, but they were ready to face it together. In the weeks that followed Catherine's arrest, Elizabeth and Lucas faced the aftermath of a life defined by betrayal and broken trust. The courtroom drama had come to an abrupt halt, but the wounds it reopened lingered painfully between mother and son. Elizabeth focused on creating a stable environment, trying to rebuild the life they'd lost. For Lucas, the adjustment was more complicated. His entire world had been upended, and trust was a fragile, unfamiliar concept. Elizabeth watched him struggle, often in silence. He still flinched at sudden noises, hesitated before entering new places, and kept his belongings packed neatly in a backpack by the door, as if expecting to leave at any moment. It broke her heart, but she knew that healing couldn't be rushed. It had to be earned. One morning, as Elizabeth was preparing breakfast, she noticed Lucas staring out the window. His expression was distant, his mind clearly somewhere else. Lucas, she called softly, trying to draw him back. Pancakes are almost ready. Lucas turned, managing a faint smile. Thanks, he said, but his voice lacked enthusiasm. He sat at the table, poking at his food more than eating it. Elizabeth leaned forward, her eyes filled with concern. You haven't been eating much lately. Is everything all right? Lucas shrugged, his shoulders slumped. It's just a lot. Being here, knowing everything. It's like I don't know who I'm supposed to be anymore. Elizabeth felt a deep ache in her chest. You don't have to figure it all out right now, she assured him. We're taking this one step at a time. And no matter what, I'm here. Lucas met her gaze, his eyes filled with uncertainty. I want to trust you, Mom. I really do. But it's hard. Elizabeth reached across the table, placing her hand over his. I understand, Lucas. I know it's not easy, but I'm not going anywhere, and I'll do whatever it takes to help you feel safe again. Elizabeth decided it was time to seek professional help, not only for Lucas but for herself as well. She reached out to Dr. Karen Abrams, a therapist who specialized in trauma and reunification. Elizabeth had been hesitant about therapy before, fearing it might force Lucas to relive the pain he had tried so hard to forget. But now, she realized it was the only path forward. Their first session with Dr. Abrams was tense, marked by awkward silences and hesitant answers. Lucas sat with his arms crossed, his posture defensive, while Elizabeth tried to find the right words to explain their complicated story. Dr. Abrams listened attentively, her eyes kind but focused. Lucas, I know this must be overwhelming, she said gently, but it's okay to talk about what you're feeling here. There's no right or wrong way to process this. Lucas looked down, his voice barely audible. I just don't know who I can trust. Elizabeth felt tears prick at her eyes, but she forced herself to stay composed. You can trust me, Lucas, she said softly. Lucas's eyes flickered with emotion. I want to believe that, he admitted. But it's going to take time. Dr. Abrams nodded. That's perfectly okay, Lucas. Trust doesn't happen overnight. It's built slowly with small steps. As they left the session, Elizabeth felt a glimmer of hope. It was a small step, but it was in the right direction. At home, Elizabeth and Lucas found themselves navigating new territory. Elizabeth tried to give Lucas space while also being present, a delicate balance that often left her feeling unsure of whether she was doing the right thing. One afternoon, she noticed Lucas staring at an old family photo on the living room wall. It was from before the kidnapping. Lucas was just a toddler, beaming at the camera while Elizabeth held him close. "That was a long time ago," Elizabeth said, her voice soft. Lucas nodded slowly. "I don't remember much about it," he admitted. "But I wish I did." Elizabeth's throat tightened. "I wish you did too. But we can make new memories. It's not too late." Lucas turned to face her, his expression both hopeful and hesitant. "Do you think we really can? After everything?" Elizabeth's eyes were filled with determination. "Yes, Lucas, we can." But not everything was moving forward smoothly. As Lucas tried to reconnect with his lost childhood, Elizabeth found herself haunted by lingering doubts. What kind of mother had she been to not have seen the truth sooner? Could she really protect Lucas now, when she had failed him before? These questions kept her awake at night, gnawing at her sense of worth. One evening, as they were watching a movie together, Lucas suddenly spoke up. "Mom, are you scared?" The question caught Elizabeth off guard. "Scared of what?" "Scared that I'll never really be your son again," Lucas replied, his voice barely audible. Elizabeth felt tears welling up, but forced herself to stay strong. "I'm scared," she admitted. "But not of you, Lucas. I'm scared that I'll mess up again, that I won't know how to help you. But I want you to know that no matter what happens, I'm here. And I love you always." Lucas seemed to absorb her words slowly, his eyes filling with a mix of confusion and something close to acceptance. "I want to be your son again," he said finally, his voice small but sincere. "I just don't know how." Elizabeth's heart swelled with both sorrow and hope. "We'll figure it out together," she promised. As the weeks passed, Lucas began to open up more during their therapy sessions. He talked about his years on the streets, the fear of never finding a home, and the moments when he almost gave up hope. Elizabeth listened with a breaking heart, but also with a deep sense of gratitude. He was alive, and he was sharing his pain with her. Dr. Abrams encouraged them to start doing normal activities together, things they might have done if Lucas had never been taken. One Saturday morning, Elizabeth suggested a trip to the zoo, a place they had often visited when Lucas was little. Lucas seemed hesitant at first, but eventually agreed. As they wandered through the exhibits, Elizabeth watched Lucas's face light up for the first time in a long while. When they reached the lion enclosure, he stopped, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "You used to love the lions," Elizabeth said, her voice filled with nostalgia. "You'd always try to roar louder than them." Lucas looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of surprise and warmth. "I think I remember that," he said quietly. It was a small moment, but to Elizabeth, it felt monumental. Despite the progress, Lucas still had nightmares, terrors that woke him up in a cold sweat, his heart racing. Elizabeth would rush to his side, holding him close until the panic subsided. One night, as he clung to her, Lucas finally let down his guard. "I was so scared, Mom," he sobbed. "I thought you'd never find me." Elizabeth's own tears fell freely now. "I was scared too, Lucas. But I never stopped looking, and I never will." Lucas's grip on her tightened, as if trying to make up for all the lost years. "I want to be your son again," he whispered, his voice filled with raw vulnerability. "You are, Lucas," Elizabeth assured him. "You always have been." As the legal proceedings against Catherine neared their conclusion, Elizabeth felt a mix of relief and dread. The final hearing was approaching, and the court would determine Catherine's sentence. Elizabeth knew it would be another test for Lucas, one that would either cement their bond or further complicate it. One day, as they prepared to head to court, Lucas surprised Elizabeth. "I want to speak at the hearing," he said, his voice steady. Elizabeth was taken aback. "Are you sure, Lucas? It's going to be really hard." "I know," he replied, "but I need to say it. I need her to know what she did." Elizabeth nodded, her heart swelling with pride. "Okay," she agreed. "I'll be right there with you." At the hearing, Lucas faced Catherine from the witness stand, his voice surprisingly strong. "You took everything from me," he said, his words heavy with emotion. "But I'm not going to let you keep hurting me. I have a family now, and I'm going to be okay. But you need to understand what you did." Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears as she watched her son, proud of his courage and strength. She knew the road ahead was still long, but for the first time, she truly believed that they would make it, together. As they left the courthouse, Lucas looked up at Elizabeth. "Do you think we can really start over now?" Elizabeth smiled, a genuine warmth in her eyes. "Yes, Lucas. This is just the beginning." Months had passed since the final court hearing, and a cautious sense of normalcy was beginning to take root in Elizabeth and Lucas's lives. Catherine had received her sentence, 10 years in prison with the possibility of parole. It wasn't the closure Elizabeth had hoped for, but it was justice of a kind. Now, she and Lucas could finally focus on healing. Elizabeth was adjusting to her new role as a mother to a teenager, a far cry from the toddler she had lost 8 years ago. Lucas, too, was learning how to navigate this new chapter, unsure of what it meant to be part of a family again. There were still hard days, days when the weight of the past felt too heavy to bear, but there were also moments of joy and small victories that reminded them both that healing was possible. One Saturday morning, Elizabeth found Lucas sitting at the kitchen table, staring intently at a small stack of mail. He had recently started receiving letters from Catherine, who wrote to him regularly from prison. He never spoke much about them, but Elizabeth noticed how the letters affected him, sometimes leaving him distant and withdrawn, other times angry and frustrated. "Another letter?" Elizabeth asked gently as she poured herself a cup of coffee. Lucas nodded, his face expressionless. "Yeah, she keeps saying she's sorry." Elizabeth sat down across from him, her voice careful. "How do you feel about that?" Lucas sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know. Sometimes I want to forgive her, but other times, I just can't." Elizabeth reached out, placing her hand on his. "It's okay to feel that way, Lucas. Forgiveness isn't something that can be forced. It'll come when you're ready." Lucas looked up at her, a mix of uncertainty and longing in his eyes. "Do you think I should forgive her?" Elizabeth thought carefully before answering. "I think forgiveness is more for you than for her. It's about letting go of what's weighing you down. But that doesn't mean you have to forget what she did or pretend it didn't hurt." Lucas nodded slowly, absorbing her words. "I'll try. But it's hard." "I know," Elizabeth said softly. "Just take it one day at a time." As time went on, Lucas began to open up about his experiences with Catherine's letters during therapy sessions. Dr. Abrams encouraged him to write back if he felt ready, not as an act of forgiveness, but as a way to express his emotions and regain control of the narrative. One evening, Lucas approached Elizabeth in the living room, holding a letter he had written to Catherine. "I think I'm ready to send this," he said, his voice tentative. Elizabeth looked at the envelope in his hand, a mix of pride and apprehension swelling in her chest. "Do you want me to read it?" Lucas shook his head. "No, I think this one's just between me and her." Elizabeth respected his decision. "I understand. I'm proud of you, Lucas. This takes a lot of courage." Lucas managed a small smile. "Thanks, Mom." It was the first time he had called her Mom, without hesitation. Elizabeth's heart swelled with emotion, tears prickling at the corners of her eyes. The seasons changed, and with spring came a sense of renewal. Elizabeth and Lucas began to fill their days with simple joys. Visits to the park, movie nights at home, and cooking experiments in the kitchen. Lucas had a particular knack for making spaghetti, a talent Elizabeth found both endearing and unexpected. One evening, as they were preparing dinner together, Lucas turned to Elizabeth with a thoughtful expression. "Mom, can I ask you something?" Elizabeth paused, surprised by the shift in his tone. "Of course. What's on your mind?" Lucas hesitated for a moment, then spoke. "Do you think I can start going to school again? Like a real school, not just the online stuff?" Elizabeth felt a surge of both excitement and anxiety. It was a huge step, one she had hoped he would be ready for someday, but she hadn't expected it so soon. "Are you sure you're ready for that?" she asked carefully. Lucas nodded, determination in his eyes. "I think so. I want to make friends, have a normal life, you know?" Elizabeth smiled, a mixture of pride and relief. "I think that's a great idea, Lucas. We'll find the right school together." The process of enrolling Lucas in school was not without challenges. Elizabeth was painfully aware that Lucas's social skills were underdeveloped, a result of years spent surviving on the streets rather than in classrooms. But Lucas was determined, and Elizabeth supported him every step of the way. The first day of school was nerve-wracking for both of them. Elizabeth tried to mask her anxiety with cheerful encouragement as they drove to the school. "You're going to do great," she said, her voice filled with genuine warmth. Lucas fidgeted with his backpack straps. "What if I don't fit in?" Elizabeth's voice softened. "You will. Just be yourself. And remember, I'll be right here waiting for you when the day's over." As Lucas stepped out of the car and walked toward the school's entrance, Elizabeth felt an overwhelming mix of pride and fear. She watched him until he disappeared into the building, then sat in the car for a moment, tears of hope streaming down her face. The first few weeks were rocky. Lucas struggled to adjust to the structure of school life, and there were days when he came home frustrated or withdrawn. But slowly, he began to find his footing. He made a friend named Jake, a quiet boy who shared Lucas's love for drawing. Elizabeth was thrilled to see Lucas forging connections, no matter how tentative. One afternoon, Lucas came home with a smile that reached his eyes. "I got an A on my history test," he announced, holding up the paper proudly. Elizabeth's heart swelled with pride. "That's amazing, Lucas. I knew you could do it." Lucas grinned. The weight of his past momentarily lifted. "Thanks, Mom." But as Lucas began to integrate more into his new life, Elizabeth found herself grappling with a sense of emptiness. The relentless focus on Lucas's recovery had defined her existence for so long that she wasn't sure who she was outside of it. She returned to work at the law firm, but something felt different, less urgent, less consuming. One evening, as they were having dinner, Lucas noticed her quietness. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice filled with genuine concern. Elizabeth looked up, surprised. "I'm fine. Just a lot on my mind." Lucas's eyes were searching. "You've done so much for me, Mom. I don't know how to repay you." Elizabeth's throat tightened. "You don't owe me anything, Lucas. Being your mom again is more than enough." Lucas seemed to absorb her words, a thoughtful expression on his face. "I want you to be happy too," he said simply. Elizabeth felt tears welling up. "I am happy, Lucas. I really am." As the months passed, the bond between Elizabeth and Lucas grew stronger. There were still hard days, moments when Lucas's past resurfaced in painful ways, but there was also laughter, inside jokes, and a sense of closeness that had once felt impossible. One Sunday afternoon, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Lucas turned to Elizabeth. "Mom," he said, his voice steady, "I think I'm ready to forgive Catherine." Elizabeth was taken aback by the statement, her heart aching with a mix of pride and sorrow. "Are you sure?" Lucas nodded slowly. "I think I need to do it for me, not for her." Elizabeth reached out, pulling him into a hug. "I'm so proud of you, Lucas." He hugged her back tightly, a sense of peace settling between them. "Thanks, Mom." And in that moment, under the fading light of the sunset, Elizabeth knew that the long, painful journey had led them to something truly worth fighting for. A second chance at being a family. Winter arrived in New York with a soft blanket of snow, covering the city in a temporary quietness that seemed to mirror the new phase of Elizabeth and Lucas's life. It had been nearly a year since Lucas returned, and though the scars of the past remained, they had found a rhythm that felt like hope, a fragile but growing sense of normalcy. Lucas's school life had flourished. He joined the art club, a space where he found solace through sketching, using pencils and colors to express the emotions he couldn't always put into words. His friendship with Jake deepened, and for the first time in years, Lucas experienced the joys of a real childhood, albeit a little later than most. Elizabeth, too, was evolving. Her work at the law firm, which had once been all-consuming, now took a back seat to her role as a mother. She still fought for justice, but her motivations had shifted. She was more focused on creating a life that was truly balanced. Therapy had helped her find clarity, revealing not only the depths of her guilt, but also her capacity for forgiveness, both for Catherine and for herself. One December evening, as the first snowflakes began to fall outside, Elizabeth suggested a spontaneous adventure. "Do you want to go see the Christmas tree at Rockefeller Center?" she asked Lucas. Lucas's eyes lit up with a mix of surprise and excitement. "Really? Right now?" Elizabeth grinned. "Yes, right now. Let's go." They bundled up in heavy coats, scarves, and gloves and headed out into the chilly air. The city was alive with holiday spirit. Lights twinkled on every street corner, and the scent of roasted chestnuts filled the air. As they approached Rockefeller Center, the giant tree came into view, its brilliant lights casting a warm glow over the crowd. Lucas looked up in awe. "It's beautiful," he whispered. Elizabeth stood beside him, watching his face more than the tree. "It is," she agreed, her voice filled with emotion. Lucas turned to her, his expression serious but hopeful. "Do you think maybe we can start a tradition? Like, come here every year?" Elizabeth felt tears welling up, but they were tears of joy this time. "I'd love that, Lucas." They stood there for a long time, soaking in the magic of the moment. It was the kind of moment Elizabeth had dreamed of during the dark years of searching. Simple, joyful, and real. As they headed back home, Lucas reached out and took Elizabeth's hand, something he hadn't done in years. It was a small gesture, but it carried the weight of trust, of healing, and of a future they were finally building together. With the start of the new year came new milestones. Lucas's school performance had improved significantly, and his teachers often praised him for his resilience and focus. He began expressing interest in pursuing art more seriously, perhaps even attending an arts-focused high school. Elizabeth encouraged him every step of the way. "You have a real gift, Lucas," she told him one evening as she admired one of his drawings. "If that's what you want, we'll make it happen." Lucas beamed, a genuine, unguarded smile. "Thanks, Mom. It feels good to have something to look forward to." The word Mom now rolled off his tongue with ease, a sign of how far they'd come. It was no longer just a title. It was a declaration of the bond they had fought so hard to restore. One day, as spring approached, Lucas received an unexpected letter. It was from Catherine. He hesitated for a long time before opening it, unsure of what to expect. Elizabeth found him sitting on his bed, the letter unfolded in his hands. "Do you want to talk about it?" she asked gently. Lucas looked up, his eyes filled with conflicting emotions. "She says she's sorry, that she's trying to change." Elizabeth sat beside him, her voice steady but filled with compassion. "How does that make you feel?" Lucas sighed, then spoke slowly. I'm still angry, but I also want to believe that people can change. I just don't know if I'm ready to forgive her yet." Elizabeth put her arm around his shoulders. "That's okay, Lucas. Forgiveness is a process. It doesn't have to happen all at once." Lucas nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I know, but I think I want to write back, even if it's just to tell her how I feel." Elizabeth's heart swelled with pride. "That's brave, Lucas. Whatever you decide, I'm here for you." As the months passed, Lucas took more steps toward reclaiming his life. He began working on a mural project at school, collaborating with other students to create a piece that represented resilience and hope. It was his way of making sense of everything that had happened, a tangible expression of his journey. Elizabeth often watched him from a distance, amazed by his strength and growth. She, too, felt transformed. The guilt that had once consumed her was gradually replaced by gratitude, for second chances, for healing, and for the bond that had emerged from the ashes of their shared trauma. One afternoon, as they sat together on a bench in Central Park, Lucas turned to Elizabeth, his expression calm but resolute. "I'm not scared anymore," he said quietly. Elizabeth looked at him, her eyes filled with love. "I'm glad, Lucas. You've come so far." Lucas nodded, then added, "And I know that whatever happens next, we'll face it together." Elizabeth's heart felt full, truly full, for the first time in years. "Yes, we will," she promised. The story of Elizabeth and Lucas was not one of a perfect ending, but of a new beginning built on honesty, resilience, and unconditional love. The road ahead would still have challenges, but they now faced it with a strength forged in fire. As they walked back home that evening, the sun setting behind them, Elizabeth looked at Lucas, her son, her lost, now found son, and felt a deep sense of peace. There were no more secrets, no more lies, and no more shadows of doubt. Just the two of them, stepping forward into a future that, for the first time in a long while, felt genuinely bright. And in that shared silence, as the city hummed around them, Elizabeth knew one simple truth. They were finally, truly home.